Before all this took place, namely in September 1922, the council had resolved to try to put the club's tenure of the links on a sound footing, preparatory to starting out on a scheme of complete reconstruction. On my advice, they had brought Mr. Harry Colt over to survey the ground, and his report on the possibilities was most encouraging. I had asked him how much money would be required to complete the 2 courses. He said £7,000, but that he would like £10,000. I told him the club would not face this expenditure, and when we were on the verge of abandoning the project, he suggested that we should settle the layout, shape out the greens and fairways, so far as he could, for £3,000, and eventually we entered into a contract with Messrs. Franks Harris of Guildford on this basis. We had a plan prepared in September 1922, which took in all the ground out to the White Rocks, and then discovered that we could not get a long lease of the lands in the occupation of Mr. Knox and Mr. McVicker, who were tenants of the McNaughton estate, without the landlord's consent, which he refused to give. So we were compelled to adopt a curtailed layout, omitting these lands but leaving things in such shape that they could eventually be taken if they could be acquired. This second plan was prepared by Mr. Colt in 1923. These lands were then in the course of being acquired by the tenants under the Land Purchase Acts, and at some date after 1923, the landlord tried to get the land excluded from the site on the grounds that they were non-agricultural or potential building ground. In this he succeeded before the county court judge, but the tenants appealed to the High Court and the decision was reversed. In this appeal, the club secretary was subpoenaed by the landlord to attend with the minute book in an attempt to show that the club had agreed to take the land for golfing purposes. What effect this would have had in law, assuming it had been proved, I cannot say, not having looked into it, but I have always understood that lands could only be excluded from lands purchased under the Lands Act as building ground. Eventually, the club acquired part of these lands. As a result of its efforts and of the building of the new course, the remaining portion did become building ground and probably will all be developed someday as a result of the development of the golf courses. The club obtained the leases of these lands for 99 years from 1930. While plans for a new course were in course of preparation, negotiations to secure a tenure for the club which would warrant a large capital outlay were started concurrently. The captain and I were deputed to approach the railway company and Lord Antrim to see what could be done. We met the railway company officials for the first time in September 1923, Mr. Frank Tatlow being in charge of the negotiations for the company. Our first interview was far from satisfactory. We were hectored and lectured like 2 small boys, and Mr. McLaughlin was so enraged that, if I remember right, he never came back. I had some experience of these matters and held on, though I was very imperfectly informed as to our own affairs at that time. The whole management of the club was so slack and happy-go-lucky that no one knew anything about our tenure, rights, resources or prospects. I could not get the leases of the outside lands or find out what they were or how the lands were held, and our old minute books had been mislaid and could not be found. I had, therefore, to exercise considerable patience, and when Mr. Tatlow asked me how we proposed to do anything at all with an adverse balance sheet, I could only reply that until the tenure was settled, we could do nothing at all and would always have an adverse balance sheet. I had 2 interviews before I found out that the leases of the outside lands from Rankin, Morrow, Macaulay, Burns and the 2 McElhargys were in the name of the club trustees and not of the railway company, and that in addition we had about £1,000 in cash and investments. Lord Antrim's lands extend only to the fence which runs from the present clubhouse along the line of the 16th hole to the feather bed green, and from that point to the sea across the Warhollow, and are not sufficient for 2 courses. Only 3 of the holes of the Dunluce course are on these lands, and though an 18-hole course could be fitted into the area, it would be of very indifferent quality and layout. I then realised that we were masters of the situation, and I went back to Mr. Tatlow, and after listening to some very autocratic talk and some well-meant but not too intelligent advice, told him that I was going to advise the club to refuse to pay the £300 a year, which they contributed to the £500 paid by the railway company to Lord Antrim, and invited him to refuse to pay this rent any longer and to either allow us to negotiate as free agents with Lord Antrim or to persuade the railway company to do so. He said the railway company were in honour bound to Lord Antrim for the unexecuted term of 60 years until 1969, and that he did not care a damn what the club did, for unless they did what the railway company wanted, they would take over the whole works and run the course themselves. It did me no end of good to hear this, and I told him he had guessed wrong this time. So I pointed out that without the outside lands he could do nothing, that the rent paid for these was about £100 a year, and that we could close the club and pay this rent for at least 20 years, and I would do so unless the railway company saw reason. This shook him up more than somewhat, and when he had assimilated the idea, he asked what I considered reasonable. So I said, the club must have a lease from Lord Antrim for 99 years, in the names of the trustees, and the negotiations must be open and unfettered by the terms of the abortive lease of 1909. After much discussion, and in a chastened mood, he agreed that the club should be entitled to negotiate a lease with Lord Antrim, but said the railway company would not, under any circumstances, depart from the terms arranged in 1909, until that term ran out in 1969, but would pay 2/5 of the rent up to that date. I knew that we could have forced their hands on this ground, but I came to the conclusion that it was not worth the risk, and that we would probably do no better if the negotiations were open and would be up against hostility all along the line. The rent of £500 was far too high in 1909, but as the years passed, the gap was closing, and the time might well come when it would be higher. So I looked at the bargain from the point of view of what the club could stand and not what was the fair value of the lands. I then met the Earl of Antrim, and the negotiations were immediately transformed. Lord Antrim had a clear and businesslike intellect, and was a pleasant opponent. He drove a hard bargain, but was never unreasonable, and he appreciated the club's point of view as well as his own. A preliminary agreement was reached in July 1924, and the council having obtained authority from a general meeting to enter into a lease on lines generally stated, we went into all the details and finally settled them. This took a lot of time and innumerable interviews, as anyone can appreciate who peruses the leases. But when the general principles on which the new tenure was to be based were settled, the further negotiations with the railway company were conducted from Euston, and from the time they came under the direct observance of Sir William Wood, not only was there no further obstruction, but the company did everything that could be done in reason to get the golf club on its feet. When eventually all the details of the new lease had been agreed upon, and we were approaching completion, it was found that Lord Antrim, being only tenant for life, could not make a lease for 99 years under the Settled Land Act, which only provides for agriculture or building leases, and we had to go to the Chancery Division, which granted Lord Antrim leave to execute a lease for golfing purposes for 99 years under the Settled Estates Act 1877, an entirely new application of the provisions of that Act. A perpetuity lease of a site for a new clubhouse was also agreed upon under the provisions relating to the building leases in the Antrim settlement, and both leases were finally executed in 1928. There was then a standstill until the proceedings between the McNaughton estate and the two furthest out tenant occupiers were at an end. But in 1930, the club secured these lands on 99-year leases, and also a new lease of the McElhargy land, the title to which was imperfect. The club was then secure in all the lands to the White Rocks and in the position to develop the whole area of sand dunes from the town of Portrush to the White Rocks. Immediately on the signing of the lease in 1928, the Ladies' Clubhouse was built on the lands granted in perpetuity, with the idea that eventually the Men's Clubhouse would be erected on the same site, and in 1929 the new stables were erected in place of the old and very inadequate accommodation opposite the end of Rodney Street. These have been added to since then, and now the club has reasonably commodious accommodation for inside work, machines and gear of all kinds, in buildings which enclose a decent yard to which water has been laid on from the town supply. After the signing of the leases on the ground furthest out, the Greens Committee again took up the question of course construction in 1930. Much thought had been given to this side of the venture since Mr. Colt's first plan, and Mr. JSF Morrison, his partner, came over, surveyed the ground again, and prepared an amended plan. This plan was criticised in some particulars, and Mr. Colt came over again for a third time in 1932 and settled the final plan of the course as it exists today, with the exception of the purgatory and warren holes, which were added later. At this time, there was no immediate idea of surrendering the lands in the town known as the Triangle, together with the clubhouse, and the layout did not include these two holes, which were planned afterwards to replace the old first and last holes. In June 1932, a general meeting was called and power was given to the council to carry out Mr. Colt's plan at a cost not to exceed £3,200. And the work was immediately entrusted to Messrs. Franks, Harris and Company of Guildford, a firm which carried out golf course construction for Mr. Colt's firm. In this contract, I stipulated that Mr. Jack Setterfield, of whom I had previous satisfactory experience, should be sent over as foreman in charge of the work. And in July, Mr. Colt came over again with Willie Murray, engineer for Franks Harris, and laid out the work, which was begun immediately. So fast was the work done that the course was played on at Easter 1933 and formally opened in July 1933 by Sir Percy Greenaway, the Lord Mayor of London, who had come over to Derry officially for the opening of the Craigavon Bridge. There was not sufficient money to complete the course in a very finished way, but the design of the greens was fine and well carried out, and the fairways levelled to a playable extent. The amount of levelling was stupendous and hardly to be believed by people who did not keep a close eye on the work while it was in progress. Fortunately, there were deposits of light soil at some 4 or 5 places on the course, and it was possible to dig these out and use the soil for bedding down greens and tees and reinforcing some of the new fairways, though the latter were in the main made by merely lifting the soft scraws from the rough and laying them down on the bare sand after the hills had been levelled. The Dunluce course was by design kept in the open, along the contours of the dunes, in order to get the necessary length and to obtain a view of the sea, which can be seen at all but a few holes, and for coolness in summer. The lower lying valleys were left for the second course, which began as a makeshift and ended up as a course very little inferior to the Dunluce. I laid this out with Hugh McNeill, and I got Mr. Colt to go round it a couple of times in its initial stages. At that time its layout was confused, and it was only after some years' consideration and hard thinking that the present design was evolved. Since the Dunluce course was opened, the club has been continually at work. The contract provided for tees, but those made were quite inadequate, and since the handing over they have been rebuilt and added to, until we now have a minimum teeing space of 500 square yards at most holes. And we have kept to the policy of having one tee only, and not a series of small ones. Firstly, so that there shall be no question of front or back tees, and secondly, for economy of upkeep. We also had to build shelters all round the courses, which we did to a homemade design, and we piped in some 1,000 yards of burns with 9-inch and 12-inch crockery pipe, and did an immense lot of extra levelling and clearing up of fairways and filling in of walks to ease the rather heavy nature of the course. And all this time we were slowly working up the valley course, on which the staff levelled and laid 16 greens, 11 fairways, and 18 tees of generous proportion. I thought at this stage that my personal troubles were at an end, and that a new clubhouse would not be a practical proposition in my day. But some 2 or 3 years before the war, the Education Authority, being anxious to procure a site for a new public elementary school on the Triangle near Hamilton Place, approached with the present Lord Antrim and the club and offered £1,700, which was a good price for the necessary ground. The council then devised the following plan, namely that the club would join in releasing the Triangle and site which they held under the 1928 lease until 1969, unless in the meantime they built a new clubhouse on the north side of Bushmills Road. Their terms of surrender to be that Lord Antrim should pay £4,000 towards the cost of a new clubhouse and give a long lease on the other lands across the road, leaving the old clubhouse and the old first and last holes in the club's possession until the new clubhouse should be completed. After further protracted negotiations with reference to the abatement of rent, this was agreed to, and the railway company agreed to join and to advance £5,000 to the club on a 21-year building society repayment loan. The deed carrying out this agreement was eventually completed. It was proposed to raise £3,000 from the members, which would make up £12,000, which it was estimated would build and equip the new clubhouse. The £3,200 raised for the construction of the Dunluce course was obtained by debentures, some ordinary debentures carrying 5% interest and others carrying 2% and perpetual membership, and it was felt that the further £3,000 could be obtained in the same way. The site was therefore agreed to be sold to the Education Authority for £1,700, which would recoup Lord Antrim immediately for his payment of £4,000 pro tanto, and the club agreed not to ask for the reduction in rent to which they would be entitled, as consideration to the surrender under the terms of the 1928 lease, until Lord Antrim was indemnified out of future developments for the whole of the interest on the £4,000. While these negotiations were proceeding and the necessary documents being prepared, plans were drawn up for the new clubhouse, which were posted some months in the hall before they were finally approved, and the quantities were being taken out preparatory to placing the contract for its erection when war broke out and all building became impossible. Once again it seemed that we were to lose the result of all our thought and trouble. Then the idea occurred to me, why not complete the agreements and secure the 1,700 down? And if we could not build during the war or even after it, allow Lord Antrim an annual abatement on the £4,000 less half the £1,700 which should go to the club in any event, measured at the figure which would reduce it to zero in 1969, when Lord Antrim would be entitled to resume possession of the Triangle under the lease of 1928 without any repayment. This modus vivendi was with some immaterial amendments accepted, and the surrender of the lease for 999 years, together with an amended lease for 10,000 years, for a site for the new clubhouse, were duly executed in 1941. The railway company joined in this surrender and gave the club valuable assistance in getting the arrangement through. There was much argument and many negotiations in connection with the scheme, which Judge Begley and I conducted for the club, and he drafted or approved of all of the documents which were sufficiently complicated to try even such an expert conveyancer as he is. A summary of all the club leases has been prepared and is lodged in the club safe. The £850 was paid over to the club on completion, and the club thereafter became secure in its occupations of all Lord Antrim's lands across the Bushmill Road for 1,000 years. When it was first suggested, at some time in 1937, that events might make a surrender of the triangle desirable, the necessity of making 2 new holes to replace the old first and last, when this should happen, became apparent, and we cast round to see how it was to be done. Many alterations were suggested, and as Mr. Colt was in Portrush when the first Irish Open Amateur Championship was played over the Dunluce course in July of that year, he was asked to finally complete the layout. This he did, but the plan he suggested involving altering the White Rocks and Skerries holes, and considerable additional work to be done on the 2 new holes themselves. After the championship was over and Mr. Colt had gone home, I was one day speaking to Stevenson, the club professional, who asked me about the new layout. I told him how it was to be done, and he said he thought we were just going to make 2 new holes and make no further alteration. I had the programme of the meeting in my pocket, with a plan of the long course on it, and I pulled it out and said, "Here, show me what you mean." He thereupon sketched it in the present Himalaya and Warren holes, which could be fitted in, as he said, without any alterations, although they involved a cross the Himalaya and Skerries hole. I thought the cross did not matter and wrote to Mr. Colt that night giving him Stevenson's idea, which he at once adopted, saying it was strange that he and I should have missed anything so obvious and so simple. These 2 holes were begun that autumn and were finished in 1939. Both were very heavy jobs, the Warren hole especially, which had to be lifted sod by sod from the back of the tee to the back of the green, almost 500 yards, and levelled and resodded. The first 120 yards of Himalayas was already flat, but from that on it had been similarly treated, and the pond in the ravine at the Warren had to be piped into the new hollow behind the causeway green. This completed the Dunluce course, but the valley was not yet finished, as it became necessary to alter it again to make way for a new 9-hole course to replace the temporary one on the triangle for children and beginners. The ground next to the gasworks and tramway shed was available for this, and Mr. Colt advised us to finish the valley course after the long valley with a 1-shot hole to the back of the proposed new clubhouse. This disentangled the new 9-hole area from the valley course, and in 1939 and 1940 this new course was laid out and constructed, and the last hole in the valley made in 1941-1942. The 2 new valley holes, the Desert and Currant Point, were made in 1936, and the War Hollow and Middle Green in 1938, after which there was a general rearrangement of the course in its present shape. In this rearrangement, a lot more levelling had to be done, mainly in the War Hollow, which was very tedious, but it was all finally completed by 1942, and a large gap cut into the hollow beside the Middle Green, through which pipes were laid to drain surface water from this area in very wet seasons. And so these courses were built and completed on a scale hardly contemplated when the work began. The levelling was done with American scoops, a trick we had learned from Franks Harris, and without them the work would have been impossible. The valley course was a surprise effort. This course started as a makeshift course for the ladies, with some old and some new holes. Gradually it dawned on Hugh McNeill and me that it had all the makings of a first-class course, so we set out to see what could be done about it. And having first of all solved the question of the layout, we went ahead each winter, gradually working it up. It took 10 years' hard work to get all this through, but the valley is now a fine course with a double set of tees for ladies and men, and only requires to be got into condition to be one of the best in the country. One of the most pressing difficulties facing the club when this reconstruction began was the question of sand blow. Owing to the depredations of trippers who wandered from the East Strand through the sand hills, large wind gaps had been formed in the hills, and in 1932 the Long Valley Green and the 4th and 6th on the 9-hole course, which were all greens in the old course, were completely submerged. While we were working at the courses, we abandoned these greens temporarily and set to work to try and stem the sand blow. Major Mayers, a member of the club, came to our aid and made a road in from the gasworks along the top of the sand hills to a point opposite the Valley Green, and brought in clay and sods to stabilise the upper areas, while down below on the sea level, wattles and bushes were placed to catch the sand. This was effective, and as the banks rose, they were planted with bent grass. At one point, opposite the recess hole on the Dunluce course, the bank, probably 30 feet high, was raised, covering the entrance to a wind gully into which the sea had made its way, and from which there blow in high north winds spread over a large part of the Warhollow. This work had been described in an article in the research journal to which anyone may refer who wishes to know more about it. The Portrush UDC were also impressed by the results obtained, that they offered to make a new promenade from the Arcadia to the old stream, which discharged past the gasworks onto the shore, and after meeting with them and Lord Antrim in the town hall, the club agreed to give the land beyond the stream for nothing, if they would continue the promenade past the Ben in the sandbank, which had always been the danger point for the club. This has cleared up a very sore spot and has provided the club with a defence against the wind at the most dangerous part of the course, and frees the gasworks end of the links from a lot of trespass. It should, however, be pointed out that this damage through trespass and sandblow is continuous and has to be dealt with in various places from time to time, and may again at any time become really serious. I now give a list of the greens, tees and fairways laid and general work done. Greens laid on the Dunluce course, all but the 18th. The Valley course, all but numbers 9 to 11 and 17. All tees laid on both courses. Fairways laid or levelled and reconditioned on the Dunluce course. Number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, last half of 12, 13, 15 and 17. On the Valley course, the first to the last half of 4, 5, 6, 7, the first half of the 8th, the 10th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th and the 16th. In addition, we laid 4 greens and 7 tees and levelled a considerable area of the 9-hole course. We also made a number of walks and causeways, such as those at Primrose Dell, their tavern and Calamity, and built the shelters and laid the pipes already referred to, in addition to much other work. The club can never be too grateful to Hugh McNeill, under whose supervision all of this work was carried out, and for his sound organisation and the energy he displayed himself and inspired in his staff. Where did the money come from? Well, we spent £1,200, which we had in investments. We borrowed £3,200 from our members, so £4,400 in all. The balance was paid for out of revenue, and in the end the courses cost the whole of Mr. Colt's estimate of £7,000. So what was the total cost? I would say about £12,000, made up of £1,500 in the ladies' clubhouse, £400 on stables and sheds, £800 regarding sand blow, £300 on pipes, £700 on law costs, £1,000 on equipment, tractor, gang mowers, hand mowers, horses, carts, scoops, etc., £212 on architects' fees, £3,500 to Frank's Harris Brothers, £1,500 additional cost of finishing the course and making of 2 new holes, £120 on sheds and shelters, £2,000 estimated cost of the Valley and the 9-hole courses. So how was this done? by popularising the club and by the goodwill of our members and visitors, and the efforts of the staff from the secretary down to the boys who weeded the greens. We put the membership on a sound footing by doing away with entrance fees and graduating the subscriptions on a mileage basis, and now members living within 10 miles of the clubhouse pay an annual subscription of £8, and those outside this area £5. And at the time the last increase was passed, an entrance fee of £5 5 shillings was reimposed. There can be no doubt that this was a sound policy, and that its adoption has greatly strengthened the club, for our membership went from about 600 in 1931 to 888 in 1955. The courses could easily carry a membership of 1,500. The other revenues from visitors to the clubhouse increased proportionately, and so further development has been made possible by the popularity of the courses and the enterprising policy of the council. The foregoing record brings the history of the club, so far as I know it, to the end of the war in 1945.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.